Ever heard that saying, intelligence is knowing a tomato is a fruit, wisdom is not putting it in a fruit salad?
Yeah.
Well, get ready, because in this deep dive, we're jumping headfirst into the world of Mossad.
Where the lines between intelligence, wisdom, and, let's be real, sometimes just sheer audacity get so blurred they're practically invisible.
We're going deep, way beyond the spy thriller tropes, to unpack how a nation that's been staring down existential threats since day one built an intelligence service that's a global powerhouse.
And when I say by any means necessary, I mean it.
But here's the thing that really got me, to really understand what Mossad can do, what they're willing to do.
You gotta rewind the clock.
Go back to the very beginning.
To those early days of Israel.
A brand new nation.
A nation forged in the aftermath of the Holocaust.
Imagine the weight of that.
Every piece of intel, every operation could be the difference between surviving
and vanishing.
They had to become masters at leveraging every single advantage.
Intelligence wasn't just about gathering information.
It was about survival, pure and simple.
So we're not talking like posh offices and fancy gadgets.
Oh, absolutely not.
This is an organization that was forged in the fires.
Literally.
Of pre-state Israel.
Think sneaking weapons past the British.
Underground networks, secret alliances.
They were even willing to recruit, get this,
What?
former enemies of the state if they had valuable skills.
You're kidding.
I'm not. They needed to use whatever they had.
That's wild. So they were, what, turning double agents right from the jump?
That was just their reality. They couldn't afford to be picky. And that's what's so fascinating about looking back at their origins.
It's a long way from those scrappy beginnings, though, to pulling off some of the operations they become known for, wouldn't you say?
Oh, without a doubt.
I mean, we're talking missions that would make James Bond himself order another martini just to process.
Right. It makes you wonder, was there one operation, one turning point where they announced themselves to the world, where it all changed?
Well, if you're talking about a single event that put Mossad on the map, it has to be Operation Eichmann.
1960. The world thinks Adolf Eichmann, the architect of the Holocaust, he's gone. Vanished.
Swallowed up by history.
But Mossad, they get a tip. He's alive and well, living under an assumed name in Argentina.
Hold on, they're going to try to snatch a Nazi war criminal from another country.
Not just try, succeed.
How do you even begin to plan something like that?
Meticulous doesn't even scratch the surface. We're talking months of surveillance. Agents slipping into Argentina undercover.
Creating entirely new identity.
They had to make sure they could grab Eichmann without anyone, any authorities, having a clue.
And this is the part that gets me. When they finally confront him, his reaction, it's chilling.
I've been expecting this moment.
Like he knew deep down they'd find him. That there was no escaping his past.
No escaping justice.
And this was about more than just revenge for Israel.
Oh, much more. This was about bringing one of the most notorious figures of the Nazi regime to justice on their own terms.
It was a message to the world.
A line in the sand, never again, wasn't just a slogan, it was a promise.
And they were willing to go to extraordinary lengths to keep that promise.
They had to.
Because the world, especially back then, it wasn't exactly a safe place for Israel.
Not at all. They were surrounded by hostile states, many of them armed to the teeth by the Soviets.
So how do they navigate that?
Yeah.
The Cold War's in full swing, the threat of another Holocaust. It's a very real fear.
This is where we really see that by any means necessary ethos in action.
Talk about a wake-up call.
It really shook them.
You'd think after all those daring operations, those seemingly impossible victories, they'd be ready for anything.
That's the danger, isn't it?
Well,
Believing your own hype. It's a classic case of groupthink, something intelligence agencies are constantly battling.
so Mossad, they got so used to, what, being the best?
They started discounting any evidence that didn't fit their narrative, their image of being this unbeatable force.
And boom, reality hits.
The Yom Kippur War was a stark reminder
Of what?
that even the best, the brightest, they can fall prey to their own biases.
And it wasn't just some theoretical intelligence failure, was it?
No, not at all.
This had real consequences.
Devastating consequences for Israel.
So how do you come back from that?
By taking a long, hard look in the mirror.
I imagine there was some soul-searching after that.
The Yom Kippur War forced a reckoning, a painful period of introspection for Israel's entire intelligence apparatus. They had to admit they'd gotten complacent.
What were the major takeaways?
Well, they realized technology, guts, even that willingness to bend the rules,
Which they had in spades.
it wasn't enough. They needed to get back to basic.
Day 6 meaning.
The human element of espionage.
Okay, I need you to spell that out for me.
Instead of always going for these big, splashy operations,
Right.
they needed to focus on cultivating assets, building deep, long-term relationships with sources on the ground,
People they could trust.
people who understood the nuances.
The whispers in the Casbahs.
Exactly. Sometimes the most valuable intelligence, it comes from a conversation, not a stolen file.
Okay, so less Mission Impossible, more like, what, Tinker, Tailor, Soldier, Spy.
Something like that, though they weren't afraid to act decisively when they had to.
And that brings us to, well, it has to be one of the most daring hostage rescues in history.
Entebbe,
1976.
a hijacked Air France plane,
Over 100 hostages, mostly Israeli, held captive in Uganda
thousands of miles away.
by terrorists demanding the release of prisoners.
A logistical nightmare.
And Uganda at the time, let's not forget, it was ruled by Idi Amin.
Not exactly the most stable or predictable of negotiating partners.
So what possessed them to even attempt to rescue?
They felt they had no other choice. Hostages were in danger. Every hour that passed increased the risk.
Plus, there's that Mossad DNA.
Right, that deep-seated belief that they could defy the odds, pull off the impossible. But this time, they learned from their mistakes.
They weren't going in blind.
Meticulous planning was paramount. They exploited their knowledge of Entebbe Airport, which, ironically, had been built by an Israeli company a few years earlier.
Well, isn't that always how it goes?
They combined that intel with a healthy dose of deception and just brute force, to be honest.
And it worked. Hostages were freed, the world was stunned, and Mossad, well, they added another unbelievable chapter to their legend.
That's one way to put it. But the world keeps spinning, right? New threats emerge, new conflicts.
And for Israel, one of the most complex and enduring conflicts was brewing right on their doorstep.
The Lebanese Civil War.
A tangled web of militias, religious factions, political agendas. You had Israel, Syria, the PLO, all these outside actors stirring the pot.
Chaos. Absolute chaos.
This wasn't like anything Mossad had faced before.
Exactly. This wasn't about clear battle lines or chasing down some Nazi war criminal.
It was about navigating a shadowy world of proxy wars, shifting alliances, where every move had the potential to backfire spectacularly.
Which, of course, it did.
And this is where we get to the Sabra and Shatila massacre.
A horrific event. Hundreds of Palestinian civilians murdered in cold blood.
Even all these years later, it's a dark stain on the history of the conflict.
A brutal reminder of the unintended consequences, the blowback. That can come from covert operations.
Mossad wasn't directly involved in the massacre itself.
Right. But they were supporting the Christian Phalangist militia, the group responsible.
It makes you wonder how much control they really had, you know, in a situation as volatile as Lebanon.
Were they calling the shots or just trying to keep up? It's a question that still haunts a lot of people to this day.
Because in the case of Lebanon, it seems like their influence on Israeli policy was limited.
They provided intel, sure, but ultimately, the decision to intervene militarily to back certain factions, that rested with the politicians.
Another example of that tension between gathering intelligence and shaping policy.
Knowing a tomato is a fruit versus knowing not to put it in a fruit salad.
Exactly. But even as they were grappling with the quagmire of Lebanon, a new kind of conflict was emerging.
One that would challenge everything they thought they knew.
The First Intifada.
The Palestinian uprising.
This wasn't about tanks and fighter jets. This was about everyday Palestinians rising up.
Stones against tanks.
How do you fight that?
Yeah.
How do you gather intelligence on a population that's largely turned against you?
That was the million-dollar question, and one that would force a fundamental shift in Mossad's thinking.
And the enemy list, it's not static, is it? The world keeps turning, new threats emerge.
It's a target that never stops moving. And by the 21st century, no threat loomed larger for Israel than Iran.
The PLO, Hamas, they were still players, but Iran was in a whole other league.
Absolutely. They were openly hostile, bankrolling groups like Hezbollah, arming Israel's enemies.
And on top of that, they were actively pursuing their nuclear program.
Which, as you can imagine, sent shockwaves through Israel's intelligence community.
Given everything we've talked about, their history, I mean, the very existence of Mossad is tied to this idea of never again.
The thought of a nuclear-armed Iran, it was, and still is, viewed as an existential threat.
So how do they respond? How does Mossad, an organization born in the fires of one conflict, confront this new, terrifying reality?
Enter Mir Dagan.
The new director.
He takes over in 2002, and let me tell you, he was not a man content to sit on the sidelines.
From what I've read, Dagan was a former general, a hardliner.
He believed in action, not words, and he wasn't afraid to shake things up.
So under his watch, Mossad undergoes a major transformation.
Dagan understood that the rules of the game were changing. The old playbook, it wasn't enough.
So what does he do?
He pushes for shorter-term operations, less reliance on those deep cover agents, the ones embedded for years at a time.
Too risky.
Too slow. He wants to move fast, hit hard, make an impact. He puts a huge emphasis on new technologies, particularly cyber warfare.
And this is where we get to Stuxnet.
Yeah.
I mean, it's practically the stuff of legend now.
It isn't.
The world's first cyber weapon.
It was a game changer. A joint operation, the CIA and Mossad, though they'll never admit it publicly.
And what did it do?
It infiltrated Iran's nuclear facilities. But here's the thing. This wasn't about stealing secrets. This was about sabotage.
This virus, it caused physical damage.
Centrifuges spinning out of control, the whole enrichment process thrown into disarray. The Iranians, they had no idea what hit them.
It's one thing to hack a computer system. It's quite another to reach through the screen and wreak havoc in the real world.
Cyber warfare, it was a whole new frontier. And Mossad, they were on the cutting edge.
But they didn't stop there, did they? I mean, Stuxnet was huge, but Dagan, he was playing a whole other game too.
The targeted killings.
Iranian nuclear scientists starting to die under mysterious circumstances.
Car bombs, shootings, even a remote-controlled bomb attached to a motorcycle.
Again, Mossad, they've never officially taken credit.
They don't have to. Everyone knows who is behind it.
It was a brutal campaign, no two ways about it, but did it work?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Did they slow down Iran's nuclear program, or did it just make them more determined?
It's hard to say.
The truth is probably somewhere in between. But one thing's for sure, those killings, they sent a very clear message.
Cross us, and there's nowhere to hide.
Even if you're a scientist, halfway across the world.
It's a chilling thought. But we have to be honest. All this talk of cyber warfare, targeted assassinations, it paints a pretty grim picture of Mossad, doesn't it?
It's not exactly the stuff of spy novels, is it? No glamorous gadgets or shaken not stirred martinis.
So where does that leave them? As we wrap things up here, I'm curious, what do you think the future holds for Mossad?
They're facing a world that's more complex, more interconnected than ever before. The old ways of doing things, they're not always going to cut it.
So what happens next?
Well, they're adaptable. They've proven that time and again. I think Mossad will continue to evolve, to embrace new technologies, to become even more adept at operating in the shadows.
Because the stakes are simply too high for them to fail.
Exactly. Whether we like it or not, intelligence agencies like Mossad, they're a part of our world. They operate in the shadows, making life or death decisions in the name of national security.
And it's up to us as citizens to grapple with that reality.
To ask the tough questions, to demand accountability, to never forget the human cost of these conflicts.
Because as we've seen today, the world of espionage, it's not black and white. It's a world of moral ambiguities, of impossible choices.
And understanding that complexity, that's the first step in navigating the challenges of the 21st century.
Well said. And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder the shadowy legacy of Mossad.